Hey Capshovians, mark your calendars for January 23rd and 24th as we bring you the first ever Capshovians Live in Orlando. We are bringing together a dozen expert speakers to dive deep into the just one, key strategy you need to scale your marketing and your business in 2024. You get an exclusive peek into the future of the Capsho software and connect with leading industry figures. Whether you're looking to network with fellow entrepreneurs, learn from top-notch experts, or just want a memorable experience, this is the place to be. We are keeping this event intentionally intimate so that you're not just another face in a crowded room. Yes, we want to get to know each and every one of you, so spots are very limited, which means you're going to need to grab your ticket now. Go to www.capshovianslive.com and get in on the early bird pricing before it goes up. That's www.capshovianslive.com, and let's take on 2024 together.
WV Uncommon Place. This podcast is a variety podcast that houses numerous series to cover mental health, empowerment, podcast framework, and various intimate theories to get to know the hosts, along with occasional movies reviews and dives in pop culture with our event podcast episodes. The Uncommon Place digs into bringing guests on that stories don't fit the mold and are very different. WV stands for the great state of West Virginia, and every quarter we cover something in West Virginia. Stacey and myself, JR, are your hosts, so please come along for this venture to our Uncommon Place.
Howdy, I'm JR. And this episode right here is entitled Episode 400. This podcast in its full inception has been around since 2018. So one thing that we can kill here is that I'm not a pandemic podcaster. I'm a podcaster that's pod faded, returned, and decided to record shows like Tupac and keep going. Having evergreen content, following all these mantras and mottos and different things and stuff that I've heard from so many other people to make the show that I have today. I've originated quite a few different things here and there. And I've even gone as far as, a stretch where it's basically been on me to figure out what's next for the show. Along the way, Stacey has come along and helped out. She's helped with merchandise, being a co-host, even branching off for us to have Sparrows under review. And then another great thing that happens in podcasting is you upgrade your equipment. You start being more mobile with what you're doing. Or if you're not more mobile with what you're doing, you just start getting your workflow proper. Money comes in, money goes out. You get high ratings. Your show does good. Your show does bad. You tank. So many different things with technology have changed. AI has become something that is truly amazing and great. But at the same time, AI has made things a whole lot easier when it comes to show notes. The difference in using consistent virtual assistants to not having a virtual assistant, because to be honest, the workload, I've got mine in a nutshell, and when I go back and I look back over all these episodes, how the show went, when I pod faded, when I came back, a few things came to mind that I want to talk about. And the first thing I want to talk about is this. I don't have a story where someone told me not to keep podcasting. I didn't have a situation where someone really tried to challenge me in my show and, be all crazy and all gangster. Yeah, I had a few feuds with some podcasters, and I had some ill business that even I did. Some podcasters that I wish that we didn't fall out on the terms that we did. But like anything in life is life. Things happen, and I'm just one of those people that I have to, acknowledge that I'm not perfect. I'm not right in all essence and in everything that I do. I'm just a normal human being like you all. And what brought this 400 episode to my attention was when I looked at my count on my Spotify for podcasters, and yes, my podcast, one thing there that I like to get out is that my show came out on Anchor. It came out for free. The only money that I invested in my show when I first started was in the microphones. I bought a Samsung microphone to clip onto my MacBook, and I'm name dropping everything I use for the simple fact that it doesn't matter what technology you use to do your podcast, but these are the things I use. I'm just letting you know what I use. So I recorded, and I didn't care necessarily about the echoing, the hollowness in certain parts, or my show sounding like this. And then I learned about mic position. I learned from the Sean Chapmans. I learned from the Harrison Barons about SEO. I took the time inside podcasting while I was podcasting to learn. And that's something that you have to be careful with, because some people have the aptitude to learn, but they don't have the aptitude for application. And that's something that I had to grow into, because I didn't know that you really have to be patient. You really have to be on point. You really have to understand that inside podcasting, there is a lot of failure. And I was one of the first people. I would tell you my failure from the get-go. I have never had a point where I will share much success with you, because like I said before, the whole motto has always been success is silent. I went to school. I grew up in an era where we didn't get participation trophies. When you did well, you acknowledged it to a degree, and then you moved on. And not saying that to be disrespectful to any other people, podcasters, content creators, anything like that, but that was just how things went. So the story rolls like this. On April 4th, 2018, I returned back to podcasting from doing a podcast with someone else. And that podcast is now defunct, and it doesn't even exist now. By April 13th of 2018, I was done podcasting. It didn't do what I wanted it to do. So I walked away. I said, hey, man, I was living my life. And I'm glad I walked away at that time that I did, because I experienced probably the wildest year and some change in my life between 2018 to 2020 or 2019, whatever. So I returned August 5th, 2020. I did the show, then I made a trailer. And then the next episode that came out was what I knew was going to keep me going. Streaming services. The one after that, video game streaming services. And then I talked about projectors. And I talked about different topics. My cousin came on. I thank him for that. Lotus Jackson, big shout out to you for coming on. I met him when I was filming Judge Judy. Gladys Knight and Patti LaBelle. That was my first Versus episode. Me and my cousin, he was in the infancy of this show. My cousin David was with me on there. Go definitely check him out on Instagram. Rosa, shout out to, and I'm giving shout outs real quick, because like I said, this is the 400th episode. Shout out to Rosa for being my first guest outside of my cousin, because she came with her story. She was talking about what she was offering in the world. We'll put that stuff out there. And then thank you to Stacy for giving me the connection to Erica, which me and Erica was cool. And at that time, to the employer she was with, West Virginia Farmers Market. That was my first thing that dealt with the title of my show. Now, one thing I want to throw in here about my show, and what was crazy, is my show is called West Virginia and Commonplace. And the common thing that I get out of this from a lot of people is, man, you barely do shows about West Virginia. I said, well, I cover some things. I said, but if you listen to what I tell you in my intro, you understand I do quarterly things. There are other great shows out there covering West Virginia and every aspect of West Virginia, but I give you a little trinkle and a little taste here and there. So please don't hurt me, Hammer, or anybody else, or whatever. Now, my first guest was Drop Top Dre. He was a musical guest. A friend of mine from up in New York, out there in Jamaica, New York, is his manager, and put him on with me. And that was my first, that was my second remote interview. And the audio on that shit is atrocious. That shit was horrible. And then I did a TV stream update episode. I updated on that. That was continuities that I was doing there. And then I thought I was a genius and I wrote how to make a podcast because I was showing people how to use Anchor and blah, blah, blah. Decent episode in my mind. Looking back on it, probably wouldn't have released it. Then one of the episodes that moved me into a different echelon came from a friend of mine that is a friend of mine by proxy through my sister, Valen, a great person named Carmen Haskins. She came through and she had written a book and she allowed me to interview her. The first mistake I made in this was I should have gotten her book before I interviewed her so that I could have given her better coverage. But we went through it. She talked about it. So we walked through that. And my cousin David, I'm sorry, he goes by Devontae. Devontae came on the show and we just talked. We talked about stuff and just went on. And then an interview with Hunter Ferris was never released. But the cool thing about Spotify was able to backdate it to when it should have been released. So it was supposed to release November 14th in 2020. So I went back and backdated it and put it out there so anybody wants to listen to that. Then I was using a service called Poddit, and Poddit is what was absorbed and later became Alex Sanfilippo's Podmatch. So definitely go check that out if you get a chance. Heather Ross was someone that I pulled from Poddit. And she told an amazing story. And then later on down the road, she became a podcaster. And she has an amazing show that's still on to this date. And certain ironies and different things that went on there. I'm so glad that she got into a podcasting space because the message that she delivers has helped a lot of people. I had another show, and we're not going to go through all 400. I'm just going through a few that work with me. And then here, let me give you a little bit of heartache and heartbreak for me inside of podcasting. I thought that a bunch of people would just be happy to do a show with me because people are always happy to talk to me. People I went to high school with and stuff like that. But an amazing person, Amy Banton, came on my show. We went to school together. She was one of the people I admired during school. It was a group of her and her crew were a group of people. They were highly intelligent, very punctual. They were nice to everybody. So I had her on the show. And she told her amazing story. And she takes some of the prettiest pictures ever. So if you ever get a chance, check out Amy Banton out there on Instagram with her pictures. Did a few different more shows. I did a show with a film guy and a director, and that kind of that opened up my eyes to that. Hey, you can bring on people that do movies and stuff like that to work. And then I met Lisa Sheely. Lisa Sheely is a podcasting virtual assistant. And in the infancy of this show, a lot of people won't know this, but, you know, and now I don't even know where she is in life now. We haven't probably talked in 2 years. But she was very instrumental in giving me pointers and certain things to make the show attractive to a more niche down audience. In those certain little cues that she gave me, I stayed with those. Then, December 10th of 2020, I interviewed Jazz Garcia. Can I Say Jazz podcast? We have been podcasting friends ever since that date. And she has a great show over there. If you get a chance, check her out. And my first beef in podcasting, this European group of Laura and David, I had them on my show one time, and then I decided to bring them back because, you know, their numbers made sense. And somehow they thought that I was trying to steal some ideas from them because they were going to do a podcast. Now, lo and behold, they never released a podcast. And that was my first European beef. And that was the first time that I got in the ring as the greatest podcast and intercontinental champion on earth. And I had to defeat them. I never have gone out my way to slander someone on the internet or nothing like that because I'm not an internet thug. But they wanted to say all this slick stuff, so I had to push them down. But that was my first international European beef. And it got me ready for more battles that would come later. And the only reason I ever had battles with people is because I always gave unsolicited advice or always... It wasn't that I pried in my opinion, but it's sometimes what I said may not have been merited at that time. So we move on to December 18th of 2020. Lark Dean Galley. Her episode alone is what changed the perception of this show, which gave us the hard mental health impact and empowerment that we needed to keep going. It also helped me because this podcast service called Podcastagram got a hold of that episode without me knowing. And I noticed downloads through the roof. Like, I mean, I was getting steady stuff. But mind you, this is like 10, 11 episodes in. And this guy hears this episode, and her message was so powerful. It was a message about living after 2 suicides. Her father and her son both committed suicide. Amen to that lady. But her story was so strong and how she was carrying on. It rang through, and even to this day is one of the crowning episodes inside of my catalog. And we go further. End out 2020. 2021 was fine. My first Podcast Collide episode was with Chaotic Neutralist. She was a podcaster from out of West Virginia. And she was one of the first podcasters that I did a show with, the podcaster. And the crazy thing about it was she was one of the first podcasters that pod faded. And this was something that the term I didn't notice then, but later on it came about. In this scenario of these pod fading podcasters was something that spilled out from the pandemic. And from her to go further, I would see way more of this, and it would be shows that had better quality than mine. And not saying that show had better quality or that it was bad or nothing, but this was one of the first ones that was very popular, had a lot of people. And I know that it could have had movement in different directions, but to each his own. That was the first show that taught me a lesson in having evergreen content and just keeping true to what you want to do. Another big interview, Gabrielle Critchlow, her and Destiny DeHaven were big ones. And on a stretch of time, I would release episodes crazy. I'd release one on the 23rd, the 28th, and the 30th of 2021 in January. Now, stepping into this next episode, Stephanie Webb, she had a podcast named Step Up Podcast. This was one of my favorite episodes at that time. Good chemistry and just the way that she flowed. She has one of those narrating voices. So from that point on, that built a friendship that still lasts to this day. And she writes amazing books now. So definitely go check her out. And then I talked to Harrison Barron. I learned about SEO. I got to interview somebody that I admired named Mike Banks, and just covered the flow and process there. And then in February of 2021, I started, and I'm giving insight to this. I started doing shows for a PR company. This was the first time that I had money coming in that somebody said, "Hey, I need you to interview this person. Here's their information. What are your set rates?" So I gave them my set rates. We got the money together. I did these shows, and I pushed these shows out, all 3 of them back to back. And in doing so, I learned through making money in podcasting and doing these shows that I have to be very careful, because you can tell when you hear those interviews that I wasn't happy. I was just there because I was getting paid, and getting paid to have guests on. It was satisfactory to me that my podcast hadn't been out that long, and, I was making money. But at the same time, it was kind of like, you're taking money, but you're not liking what you're doing. So, still keep running with the PR firms, but I learned a heavy lesson there. Be careful with what you do. So then I had on a few other guests. Episode that rings out really high for me is Podcastagram, Patrick. If it wasn't for what he did inside podcasting with doing the podcast showdown that he did during, these odd months, I would have never been able to meet Black podcasters. Because a crazy thing and a crazy story that goes along with this episode is that the friends that I have in podcasting now, I would not know them because it wasn't that I wasn't against black podcasting or Asian podcasting or anything like that. I didn't know that there were subdivisions in podcasts. I didn't know that people had made race issues inside podcasts. And I was just a podcaster. You know, I'm from West Virginia, originally from Lynchburg, Virginia. And we have transparency with color. So I'm glad for that. And I always want to say thank you to him. Some other notable guests, Ben from Skip the Noise podcast, great colleague there afterwards. Haven't lost touch, but don't hear from him too much, but we follow each other everywhere. You know, some people in podcasting follow me all the way to the degree we're on each other's Snapchat. Now, an episode that worked numbers for me was Godzilla versus King Kong review. Stacy and I decided that, hey, I need you to come on the show, let's do a show. So she came on and did this episode with me. And from her doing this episode, I didn't realize how big and how much this would move my show, you know, down the line. So either way, I always thank her for that episode because it opened up a whole lot of stuff. And another person, Vesna came on my show, and she was another person I went to high school with. I didn't even know her that well. I knew her mother because her mother's fairly popular and famous, great Spanish teacher. And she talked about her life. She was in a car. She just did it real quick for me. And that episode right there was another take that, you know, out of asking 60 of my friends that I knew from school or wherever else, they all rejected me except for 3. So thank you for that. Heather Ross came back on the show. We did Mortal Kombat review. And then on March 13th of 2020, I said, let's meet the co-host. Stacy came back, broke her silence, and that's where she came from. Now, another episode that I had a joy of doing was with a friend of mine named Jamie Bryant. She was one of the 4 that accepted, you know, what I needed, and she told us about the world of COVID through her eyes, because COVID was a big topic, and in later years, I know that it's going to be a deeper and heavier podcast because people are going to want to know about what people were doing during COVID and what they're not doing now. Then I had other guests on, and those shows were fine. Bigfoot Anonymous, Connor the Countryman, he came on, and you know, talked about Bigfoot and different things. And then my crowning moment was when I had Mike Gorgon of what was the show called? Oh my Lord, I'm sorry guys. He's in the movie with Jerry Curl. He's in the movie with Bernice. Dave Cosgrove. That's his stage name. He was on Miami Beach Toe. And anybody can say what they want about their guests or celebrities, but he was my first celebrity on my show, and he will always be an amazing thing to me because, man, he's Dave Cosgrove. Dave Cosgrove was getting it in on that show. And at a period of time in the mid-2000s, I was watching it. And it was ran by, what's her name? Oh, shit, Jennifer Lopez. I started going a little bit deeper into mental health. And with Podcast Collide, I had a bunch of people on for that. Ray Beidel came on it to talk to me about Beidel Drive-In. He was starting a streaming service, and I met him through his daughter. His daughter had a podcast, and she was another one that I started watching on this trend of of people that were amazing, and I mean bad. But she was one of these people that left podcasting, and it was another pod fader, and it was crazy to me because I just didn't pay attention to it. Another big story, Fitz Kohler, she was an amazing one. Sarah McMahon, in a wild episode, Todd Sullivan. Todd Sullivan was my first show that I did this horrible habit that I have. At some shows I will sit on. And I will sit on those shows forever because sometimes they don't curate right. And I learned about curating in the beginning. I couldn't just keep always throwing random stuff up, which that's what I did through a lot of the infancy in the middle of this podcast. I threw up a lot of random stuff, but my audience, that's why my numbers always jumped and went different ways. But people that understood this, they were there for the surprise. And at this point, I was doing shows way too close. I would have literally had 3 shows out within 5 days of each other. Ken from Kenfluence, we did a show about projectors. He's a projector guy like me, 2 guys in the projectors. Did quite a few shows. Did a show with the Relatable Voice podcaster, Lucia Montuone. Me and her are still good friends, and she's still out here podcasting. Shout out to her. She's out there doing her thing. And I did an episode, Dipset versus the Locks. That was me and Red from the Red podcast. He's out there still doing something. Then me and Stacy and Steve, Irish Steve, did the Boston episode. We were up in Boston, so we talked about that. Had Kenfluence back on the show. And then Stacy and I reviewed Vacation Friends. And on the same day that we did that, I released the show that would eventually go on, Stacy and I did, that would eventually go on to be one of my biggest hits and one of the things that kind of put me in a different realm, and that's Applebee's Tuesday. Now let's go talk about this real quick. Applebee's Tuesday was one of these deals where I just got out here and I'm telling you, I literally just talked about the way that Applebee's has influenced my life, because Applebee's has been around forever. And I go to Applebee's on Tuesdays. Blue Check Applebee's, check this out. And that's a story for another day, but there it goes. Now, what's crazy, and this is a wild thing. Stacy and I reviewed another movie called What's Love Got to Do with It? Tina Turner movie. And in thinking about that, I'm going to have to talk to her about this later. When we did that review, that was one of the highest rated movie reviews that we did. And from that point on, in the back of my head, I realized that Stacy and I at some point would have to go do something else outside of my podcast. And that eventually grew into what Sparrows Under Review is. And me, being soft in the game, being an R&B lover, I started the Love series. And I talked about romance, and I talked about something that didn't always have to deal with sex. My first episode was called Romance, My Way to the Top. Then another episode that I sat on too long, Elliot Vang, I put it out. And that was my first occurrence of dealing with a guest that obviously I held onto a show too long, so he got pissed off. He acted however he acted. I still put the show out. It did its numbers. I didn't promote it. Then I dabbed into some other shows. Did an amazing podcast collab with High and Doing Things host, Lucille Cody. Great podcaster. Definitely go check her out. And then at this time, I had too much of an archive of shows, so I started putting them out. And then I was working deeper with podcasters. I did another show with Red called Rain. And that's Red for, just Red 904. I did a show with Big T from I Can't Make This Up podcast. And he's one person that I will admit in podcasting, I dropped the ball with. Me and him at one point, we're going to do a series about animation and stuff like that. And just like it's something about the atmosphere in podcasting, different energies, different vibes, different waves, and different stuff happens. So people move and groove however they do. So shout out to Big T. I Can't Make This Up podcast. Another podcast that I'm not going to say is defunct, but did pod fade out. So I started noticing a trend with podcasters, not with them necessarily doing shows with me, but I noticed that later on, well, I didn't notice this. I knew this later on down the road, that when I look back and I listened to some of these interviews again and just check things, it was certain things that were kind of in the cracks that you could kind of see that some of these people were done or were ready to leave because of certain circumstances. And one thing inside podcasting that kind of got me in the wrong manner was that I always thought that you needed to make a quick dollar first. When I got some popularity, or in my head, like I said, in my head, I felt like I got famous. I was this podcast. I didn't never say I was a guru, but I felt like I was a podcast connoisseur. I thought about dollars. I thought about how to make money in the smart way. So I started looking at certain guests, and as we're going along on this road, I brought back a West Virginia person. Her name was Carly Bell. She had an amazing book, Sally the Shoe, and talked to her covered that. And then I realized that my age demographic for my shows was 27 to 72. So I brought in a man named Richard Hyduck. Richard Hyduck had was a baby boomer person. So having him on the show made a lot of sense. Then a show that made me jump up and once again is something that is great in my catalog. So the catalog, I said Lark Galley. I said, and this one right here, Skip Monodragon. Skip has a strong story. He wrestled just like I did, but his book, Wrestling Depression is Not for Wimps and National Wrestling Champions, it struck a chord with me and made me a better podcaster. And then I did a show called Love Saw It. It was one of my In My Feelings podcasts. Had Sean Chapman on, the audio guy. Had Frank from Let Me Be Frank on there. Then over time, I had somebody else on, Calvin, the Google guy. He buddy of mine. He did the same thing I did. He published a bunch of different shows. I mean, he did a bunch of stuff with Google Maps and letting people know about food. I will let you know. And then Michelle, I told about our love story and what happened there. And that was something that struck a chord with a lot of people, and it made me human. It was one of those episodes that gave you insight to who I am, because understanding the life that I lead with Stacy, but understanding that some of that past and knowing it made you understand that I'm a little tender. Then I talked about Movies 10. Movies 10 was a dollar theater. It was a dream come true where I'm from. And this would later lead on to more things with film and stuff. And somewhere around that time, I met a great podcast called Galaxy of Film. And shout out to Max and Danilio. Those guys were amazing over there. Because of faults of my own, certain things happen behind the scenes and we're not cool no more. But still shout out to them, because if it wasn't for them, in certain instances, certain things wouldn't have been accomplished with my show. So thank you there. Lisa Sheely, I had on again. Stephanie came on to promote what should Dragon do? And then I met a podcaster named Michelle who had a podcast called My Comeback Podcast. Another podcaster that faded away. I know this is starting to sound a little wild. And me and her had good chemistry. We worked together. She learned how to use Zoom. She was one of the first people that embraced learning and working with me, and we worked behind the scenes, and great deal there. We made evergreen content. I was able to re-release content later that she released, just mix it up a little bit. Aaron from I Had to Say It podcast came on. Great guy there. Going further and further into this, telling about different episodes, like a great podcaster, Arce. He had a show in Skank Bank, and I won't say he's pod faded because I don't necessarily know what goes on with him. But once again, great podcaster. It just seems like after the pandemic and certain things, people's lives went a certain way, and things happen how they happen. Alexa Martin, she is an interesting, the Stop Scrolling Challenge. She's an interesting person because her interaction through Instagram, she was one of the first guests, and probably, I'm not going to say the only, but one of the first guests that helped promote the show in the way that it worked out better for me. I had a chance to have Jay from the Cognac Room on the show, which we've only done one show together, just me and him. I put him on some of my posse cuts. We did Podcasting 101, a way to make your show worthwhile. He is a great mind inside podcasting if you get a chance to work with him. And then I had Ray Beidel back on. And then on Stacy's birthday in 2021, I did the Stacy episode so we could hear from her. And that closes out that year. Now moving on to 2022. I realized that I started to need to make episodes once a week. So Jimmy Fitz, the Ethical Drug Dealer, was a show that I made. And it was pretty good. It was one of those deals that I just ran with, and it was cool. And, I had other guests on that were pretty good. But January 27th, finally, King Germ from formerly Frocast, now Podding Save My Marriage, we finally did a show. The show was so big that we had to break it up into two parts. The first part was called Calamity Part 1. Definitely make sure you go out and listen to that again. King Germ has been very influential in podcasting, introducing me to other podcasters, and making the six-figure podcasting club, and that's 6 figures of people that make money outside of podcasting, I guess, too. So shout out to him. Shout out to Queen Germ. If you don't listen to their show, you are missing out on the world there. And from that point on, I released different stuff. I did a Moonwalker episode. Part 2 of Calamity came out in February. Did an amazing show with the host of Pillow Talk with the T. Then a crowning show that I wanted to do because I met this podcaster that was wild. I'm telling you, like, just the way he put truth bombs out there and the way he did things. Uncle Dolomite from Too Much Game. I finally had the content the right way I wanted. And I brought it to him as the gift and the curse, the struggle and the triumph of being the best. Because he is one of the best podcasters on this solo end. He could do a show forever. I can't even talk that long. The only reason I'm able to talk this long about this is because I got content that'll keep going. But if I'm on my own, no. Did another episode about Michelle. Just giving a little bit more insight into that. Then I had Rodis on. Rodis from Chicago. Now let's talk about Rodis. Rodis behind the scenes, and I know we're going on about my 400 shows, but Rodis behind the scenes, he is a genius. Marketing, advertising, if you ever need something to go to or someone to go talk to him. Then after that, I had my first adult, I didn't know she was an adult entertainer. She just had a book about alcoholism, but later on down the road, I didn't know. But I had my first adult star on my show. Her name was Jules. And she would be the last. Well, she wasn't the last. Then I had a wrestling fanatic. Her name was Sophia. She had a show called Vocal Minds with Sophie V. I'm sorry, I called her Sophia. And Sophie V, she's still out there in the world. She is a very prominent person on TikTok. I wanted to jump into TikTok streaming, which I still do here and there. But she was one of the guiding forces. Lazo's podcast would be the last Podcast Collide episode. I gave up Podcast Collides because I realized that my audience was not jumping to these other shows. They would listen as long as they were on my format and then what I was doing. But the way that my audience was tailored, they were a little bit like me. It's going to take a little bit to get me to move. Stephanie came back on the show and did Podcast Reciprocity with me. And then I started off with a series that I'd never been able to finish. I had members from 4 Too Many Podcasts on my show. And we went from there. And then from another show that's been very big is Transformers the Movie, the 1986 episode, me and Max from Galaxy of Film, when we were all in cahoots, we covered that, and they had me on their show quite a few times. One More Chance at Love, I did an episode about pod fading. Stacy and I covered Ambulance. I was beefing with some podcasters, so I did a show called Lackluster or Lackluster. As a podcaster, we fit one of these at some point because I was having problems with some podcasters. And Star Wars Game Saga, I brought Brian on from Old Republic Podcast, and he has another podcast that's really good. Me and him went at it. And I had more guests. James Lampkin is one that comes to mind that sits pretty good. From that point on, me and him have done more work. You know, I've been on his show actually twice, which is wild. And either way, great podcaster, Mid-Atlantic guy, being from Merlin, you know. So we go from there. Stacy and I did an episode about Marvel. Why? Like, Marvel has become trash ass. We did an episode about Morbius, that movie. And then we did an episode... I started tying back into events in West Virginia. And the reason that I started getting back in that, because people once again were like, JR, y'all moved away from doing stuff about West Virginia. Can you cover something about West Virginia? So Gary Dameron let us come to ASW Bash in Beckley. We were wrestling fans. So we went there and got to see an amazing event. We promoted it. Then we got our press pass to go to Huntington Comic-Con. Shout out to Huntington Comic and Toy Convention. Shout out to you all, because you all started us on this press release deal, and next thing you know, we were covering that event. We did another one for Bash at Beckley. Did our first live interview with someone with Frankly Francisco podcast. Shout out to him. Behind the scenes, once again, another person that I can say is a friend inside podcasting, so definitely shout out to him. And then we got experimental. We got some new equipment. We got a Zoom H6. So we started doing the demos. And then I started expressing myself. I told about the biggest mistakes I made podcasting without a plan. I was just throwing random episodes out there and hoping they worked. I had quite a few more guests on, and then I did an episode that's still strong with me, Death of the COVID-19 Podcaster. Because in March of 2020, at that time, a lot of podcasters came out. It was the jazz. You had to be out here. You had to be a podcaster. You had to get a microphone, a computer, and everything, and get on here and start talking about this, and that. Well, after all this went on, these people just pod faded, and pod fading would be something else that I would talk about later on. And then one thing that I did bad inside podcasting, I had musical guests on again. And this is in the summer of 2022. And when I had musical guests on the show, I didn't realize that I am not an authority in music. Like, you're going to follow me for movies. You're going to do what I do with the projectors and stuff, because I've proven to you all time in and time out that is something that I do. But I've never told you about me putting on headphones and listening to this and that. So I brought on some guests along. Once again, these were guests that came to me from a PR firm. So I was paid to do these interviews, and I did them. And once again, when you're doing something like that for money, it doesn't work out that well because you lose passion. So Stacy and I come back. We do 2 movie reviews back to back. The Lost City and Black Phone. And Black Phone would later at some point become my biggest podcast at different points. And it's always stayed up there in the top 5. So shout out to Black Phone. Shout out to... what's the old boy's name in the movie? It don't matter, but just remember. We even covered another movie called The Princess. Like, I was heavy into that stuff. Then brought on some more guests. John Callis, When the Rain Stops. He was on Bobby's World, a cartoon series. And his book, that he was one of the first people to actually send me in his book for free. And get me to, I read the book, and then when I did the interview, and doing that was one of the crowning points for me, because it taught me that if someone is willing to give you the material, then you better read it and get into it. And from that point on, I've never been a person to be like, nah, I won't buy your product to do it, because I did buy somebody's book, read it. Then after I read the book, I decided not to have them on the show. And so nothing there went too bad. Street Fighter 35, got to work with Carmen again, and got to work with Mr. Cack, which is one of my favorite podcasters from Rage You Nerds and Mr. Cack and me. Then me and a podcaster that I will give no attention to, we had a falling out, and then we did an episode that bridged together with sort of like the Bret Hart's Shawn Michaels deal, and later on that just became worse. Just Press Foreplay, another show that pod faded that I did an episode with, part of my Unfiltered series. Then I fell in line with a lady that we started doing a few shows, and I started talking about boundaries. That was my first mental health deal where I went in and did that. And Boundaries was a good series. It was my first curated series that I did. And inside that, I released another posse cut, an amazing episode called West Virginia Commonplace Presents Russell Fest. And I got together with all my favorite podcasters. They sent me recorded clips of their top 10, and I edited it, put it together in a show. Then eventually I released it. To this day, one of my favorite episodes. Carla from She Blows It podcast, and she's back in podcasting. We did a show for my Boundary series, and then she did an Unfiltered series. And I just kept that going. Finally got to talk to a buddy of mine that has been podcasting through everything, and his name is James Scott from Across the Pond Network, Across the Pond Sports Network podcast. Great guy. If you ever get a chance, listen to some of those shows if you're into sports. Great thing there. Got to do an interview with Andre Lewis Carter, which he's a Navy veteran. And he told about black men in the Navy during the 60s and 70s, which was interesting there. Did my first BTS or behind the scenes episode, how I came up with the Boundary series. My first podcast pop-up episode was me. It was the Kinfluence edition. It was this format where I host this show, like I'm running the Zoom room. Somebody else is the host. I'm a guest, and then we have another guest. And on that one, we had Ringgold from We Need to Talk. So definitely shout out there. Then a few more podcasts, pop-up episodes, which had numerous people: Uncle Dolomite, Jay Christian, Dewan O'Neill from Grown Man Logic. And we just went further from there, with that. And then had a great guest on, Harley Sin. If you get to find out about her, she's a content creator all over Instagram. Stacy and I released the demo. Ain's a Good Bar was another episode that was very strong for me. She's a person to help you with money and stuff like that. Released demo. Corby Mitled was a show that I did. She is a tarot card reader and stuff like that. She actually is one of my biggest YouTube shows, so that was a crazy thing. And then an episode I sat on for 2 years, Powerfall Project. I released it 2 years too late. Those guys had pod faded by then, and I released it and it went wherever. Then I met an amazing podcaster, Brent Cassidy, has a podcast, Nightmare Success. Brought him on for the Unfiltered series. Did some more demos 6, 7. Did an Unfiltered with Ringgold. Noah Hawley came on and talked about some amazing stuff. Covered a rap song called Gotta Move On. Talked about the nostalgic places of my life, Fun Quest, Blockbuster. Talked about some failures in podcasting. Talked about them all where I was from. Then I had a situation with someone. So Stacy told me the greatest thing to do, and we came out with an episode called Red Tape. And then I came out with WrestleFest Extended Edition. I added some more people into it. So, just like always. Stacy got another Stacy episode for about her. Then I covered the worst date ever. Then astrology, getting into the metaphysical sense. That was stuff there that worked for me. King Germ came back on for post-COVID talks, which is another great one. And astrology had 2 parts to it. January was simple. I started off with an episode about West Virginia. Went a little bit deeper. And then I had Stephanie Webb back on my show, and at this point she had decided to give up podcasting, and having her back on for that was very emotional and strong for me at the same time, because it was like one of my greatest one of the people that I admire in podcasting is leaving podcasting. Why? And everybody has their reason for leaving and doing what they do, but I hated to see such a great show go away. Then I talked about eateries in West Virginia. And then I finally got to have on 2 ladies that have been amazing supporters, and they are great people inside podcasting, Jill and Jen from the Common Mystics. And that show came out at the beginning of this year, and it's one of my stellar shows. I will say that if you don't listen to them, you're missing out again. A lot of these people I did stuff with, and Stacy and I went to Podfest, and we were at Podfest, and we released different stuff. We did a show about Megan, and then for the month of February of 2023, my biggest show now, which is a wild Song of the South and Song of the South Black and White Edition. Being able to get the rights to stream the movie and other legal stuff behind that will be something I will be covering in another episode. So let's go on from there. Did more shows. Now, Stacy and I recorded this show. We were watching a Whitney Houston movie called I Want to Dance with Somebody. Now, this is one of her and one of our greatest shows on Sparrows Under Review. I released it ahead of time because it was something I just wanted to put out in February, because I was putting out shows quick. And Stacy and I didn't know that we had a diamond in the rough with I Want to Dance with Somebody. And I mean, we've recaptured that gold and that kind of magic still, but whatever we did in that episode, people like, or at least they like her part, per King Germ. So definitely that's one to check out. And then I just covered other things that came about. And throughout the rest of the year, like I said, Aaron came back on. We did a post-COVID talk. And then Stacy and I talked about Podfest. Podfest, that episode became, we talked about before we went, our expectations, and then we talked about when we went. And then we did an episode about the aftermath, because when you're at Podfest, you have to worry, if you're a wrestling fan, you got to worry about the Royal Rumble. Then, quietly in between here, I had an episode I did with a lady named Jackie Elliott. And Jackie Elliott's episode with, I didn't give it like major promotion, because I was doing a lot of shows and I was putting out a lot of stuff. Literally, in a stretch of 12 days, I put out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 episodes. So lo and behold, it's one of those shows that had its own wings, and it's in the top 10 of my shows. And we were at Podfest, and I recorded a show with a guy named Tom Saxophone Shea, actually. And he's a huge TikTok person, so he was another one of the biggest. He's the biggest person I've had on with a TikTok following like that, and that show was amazing. Stacy and I got press passes and were able to go to Lexington Comic-Con, so we talked about that. Then we talked about WrestleMania, and I had numerous guests on from there. The Unfiltered series, we had the Adopt Twins. That was another group that we did a show with at Podfest. So shout out to Podfest, because it did what it did. One of my favorite episodes is Harry Potter. I explained why I didn't watch Harry Potter, and going on from there. And I started the Why series, talking about why, certain games didn't work here and there. And the Why series is something that I carried on, and I started doing more about games. And then I had a little beef with a podcasting app called Good Pods, because they allow people to run their stats up and they don't monitor it, which they've done things to change that. But that was a good one. Podcast Wars, if you get a chance to hear that. And then, like I said, the Why series, I went hard with it. And I had more interviews. My mom came on the show. We did a little series discussion, part 1 and 2. Jen Hardy coming on my show. She has an amazing podcast. And having her on, that was really good. And then I just started getting into a place where I talked about DuckTales to Michael Jackson, about how I hustled and got my way to where I was. Then I started covering places that meant something to me. A lot of movie theaters, a lot of stuff has closed since the pandemic. And then I started doing a little quick series of podcasting for podcasters. Some more homage to West Virginia and other places like that. Made a little thing about Appalachian JR. So that took us through July. Then I met 12 Cal through King Germ. Him, Rodus, and Dolomite Knot released a stellar episode 30 about the 40-year anniversary of Thriller. And then I covered Death of Cinema, my crowning moment for me, because I was able to talk about why I think that cinema is going to die. And from that point on, that's basically it. And now we're at 400 episodes. So I want to thank all these people that helped me along the way. I want to leave this for aspiring podcasters and for people in general. I'm not here to give advice. I'm here to help you if you need help with your podcasting. Getting advice is something that I think we should not use in talking about freaking podcasting. We should figure something out, another way to say things, another way to, helpful hints, tips, something like that. And then the sad parts and the heartbreak. Pod fading happens. You have to really understand that when you start podcasting, this is not about making money. If you are doing this to make money, go do something else. Go get a gig job or something. Go deliver DoorDash or something. And I'm dead ass when I say that. And lo and behold, this is not fun sometimes. Sometimes you put your heart into this and do some really good content, and that shit tanks. And that's life. That's like the hardest thing that you have to deal with, is knowing that some of the greatest stuff you do, it fucking tanks. And when it happens, it hurts you. And one bit of information that I'll have to pass on in podcasting, and this was hard for me to understand, because I thought that when you make money, it just comes to you. You have to invest somewhere in your show. Be it equipment, be it how you're marketing. You've got to figure what works for you and how much time you want to spend in it. If you want things to be free, you're going to spend a lot of time in your workload. If you want ease of access, you want things to move smooth, you're going to have to spend some money. But spend that money wisely, because one thing that doesn't get taught in podcasting and with all these tools that we have nowadays is listener migration. You can pay all this money to have amazing show notes. You can pay all this money to have all this great advertising. But if you don't go in yourself as a podcaster and truly figure out why a listener leaves an app to your podcast, like social media wise, or why certain people listen on Android on this app instead of listening on the generic Google podcast app, if you don't take time to spin your head around that stuff, you can lose a ton of listeners. And this is something that does not preach. It's not something that these podcast gurus want to talk about. So that's one thing that I just stress and I try so hard to get people to understand. So on that note, thank you all. Episode 400 is ready. I'm so glad I took the time to do this. This is one of those things where I want to say thank you to Stacy for being there through thick and thin with me through all of this. Because there's been some times where I know she wanted to tell me to just quit doing this. I know it was times that she wanted me to be watching Grey's Anatomy, or at least acting like I'm watching Grey's Anatomy. And she let me come into the room and do these shows and to bring this stuff out to the public. So everyone, if you get a chance, tell her thank you. Because without her, I wouldn't be out here doing this. So on that note, I am JR from West Virginia Uncommon Place. And like always, if you seek the uncommon, that will bring you to West Virginia Uncommon Place. And I am signing off.
Please follow WV Uncommon Place on Instagram, Tumblr, Twitter, TikTok, where we have some great content, Facebook, LinkedIn. Hit up the merch store at oncommonplace.square.site. Join the email list from the website and rate, subscribe, and give feedback from your favorite podcatcher. And lastly, thanks for listening, and tune into the next episode.